Hello, you are most welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Real Impartation Moment on Tuesday Night Anatomy with Daniel Okwan. Today's section, I want to quickly review some nerves, mainly cutaneous nerves. Also, I will add the spinal accessory nerve to it. These nerves are found in the posterior triangle of the neck. Of course, we know the word cervical has to do with the neck. And so, without much ado, let's set the ball rolling. So there we are. Before I will go to these nerves, now what I'm going to do is to give you some bit of orientation to this. Now, if you look at the lateral aspect of the neck, yes, an important muscle which is, of course, dividing the neck into two main triangles is this muscle, okay, which we call the sternocleidomastoid muscle, sternocleidomastoid. Of course, with the help of this sternocleidomastoid muscle, we know that at the anterior border of this sternocleidomastoid muscle, yes, that one will be forming what we call the posterior boundary of the anterior triangle of the neck. Then, of course, at the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid muscle, yes, that one will be forming, yes, this time around, anterior boundary of what we call the posterior triangle of the neck. Of course, we know the anterior boundary is forming the posterior boundary of what we call the anterior triangle of the neck. And then this time around, its posterior boundary is forming the anterior boundary of the posterior triangle of the neck. Yes, apart from this muscle too that we find over here, which we call the trapezius muscle, this time around, its anterior border of the trapezius muscle is from the posterior boundary of this triangle. This triangle is known as the posterior triangle of the neck. Of course, we know it to be completed by the clavicle, the lateral head of the clavicle, inferiorly, okay, over here. Now, one thing that you have to know is that these two important muscles, we have cut the investing layer of the deep cervical fascia to expose them. Therefore, it tells us that they are within, they are invested in what we call the investing layer of deep cervical fascia. I'm not interested in that one for today, but what I'm interested in is to show you these muscles over here. Mainly, I'm going to talk about the cutaneous muscles, but before that, the important content of this triangle is what we call the spinal accessory nerve, okay, with the cranial nerve, of course, 11. Okay, this is the spinal part of what we call the accessory nerve over here. So as you can see now, almost if you look at the length of this sternocleidomastoid muscle, almost midway of it, what happens is that this spinal accessory nerve will enter this posterior triangle of the neck from, of course, beneath this sternocleidomastoid muscle. But actually, where is it emerging from? From the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Then, as you can see, it will run across this posterior triangle of the neck, and then, of course, deep to this trapezius muscle, we are going to find what we call the levator scapulae, and then eventually it will be running along what we call the medial border of the scapula. It tells us that, yes, apart from running deep to what we call the levator scapulae muscle, it will also be running deep to, of course, what we call rhomboideus major and, of course, rhomboideus minor. So it tells you that it could also, get compressed. Now, one thing that I want to show you over here is that this spinal accessory nerve, with respect to the relation with, of course, the sternocleidomastoid muscle, it will be supplying the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So as it emerges behind it, it gives some innervation to it. Then, of course, it also continues to give innervation to, of course, this trapezius muscle. Okay. It therefore tells us that if there is injury to this spinal accessory nerve in the posterior triangle of the neck, that's over here, then it means that yes, already this sternocleidomastoid muscle would have been spared. Therefore, of course, it tells us that the action, okay, whether unilateral or bilateral action of sternocleidomastoid will be spared. But of course, talking about shrugging of the shoulders, talking about overhead abduction, it will be impaired, okay, because of course this trapezius muscle will be affected. Okay, so that is what I want you to actually know. So that is one of those muscles, and so with respect to this muscle, taken from along what we call the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid muscle, but above where this spinal accessory nerve emerge is this nerve which we call it the lesser occipital nerve. So let's look at the lesser occipital nerve. yes, it also, yes, emerge from what we call the the posterior, aspect, okay, of what we call the sternocleidomastoid muscle. And of course, it hooks around where we have the spinal accessory nerve. That's where I showed you, it hooks around it, okay, and it ascends along what we call the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid muscle, okay, along it this way. By so doing, it will be supplying the skin, over the lateral, aspect of what we call the occipital region. Apart from that, it will also be supplying the medial aspect of what we call the auricle, okay, of the ear. Medial aspect of the auricle, as well as of a lateral aspect of the occipital region, will be supplied by, of course, this lesser occipital nerve. Now, it is important for you to know the root value of this lesser occipital nerve. Its root value is C2. Remember that these nerves, these remaining nerves I'm going to talk about, they are actually cutaneous nerves. They're actually coming from what we call the cervical plexus. And of course, by way of knowing the root value, it becomes very important so that we look at the application in our later sections. So its root value is C2. Its root value is C2. Then, apart from that, the next nerve that I'm going to talk about is what we call the great auricular nerve. Great auricular nerve. For great auricular nerve, yes, its root value is actually C2 and C3. C2 and C3. So, as you can see, yes, it is also in relation to the same muscle, sternocleidomastoid muscle. And this time around, yes, it's also emerging from the posterior aspect. But look at it. It ascends, yes, from a bit lower level. It begins to ascend upwards, and where it is going to, of course, divide into these several branches, okay, over here. And these branches, yes, are going to eventually supply, yes, the skin over the angle of the mandible, yes. Apart from that, even the parotid gland, okay, as well as, of course, the auricle, okay, around the auricle, the ear lobe, yes, around the auricle area is going to give off these branches to supply this area. That nerve is known as great auricular nerve. Yes, auricle has to do with the ear. Apart from that, the angle of the mandible, and of course, from the anterior aspect of the ear and below the ear, yes, we have, of course, the parotid gland. So it makes sense that it's going to supply these areas. Great auricular nerve. So the next nerve we are going to talk about, yes, this time around, it runs transversely, across the neck region. And the neck is cervical. That is why we call it transverse cervical nerve. Transverse cervical nerve, surprisingly, is having the same root value as the great auricular nerve. Yes, C2, C3. C2, C3. And it runs transversely. And you can see that it comes all the way from the posterior. Yes, it's going to emerge from, of course, the posterior aspect of the sternocleidomastoid muscle, but it will run transversely to get to the anterior aspect of what we call the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Okay, so that is what we see. Now, one thing that you have to know is that, yes, when it comes over here, it will also, yes, give off some branches, okay, to supply, of course, the lateral aspect of what we call the neck. Not only the neck, but also the body of what we call the mandible, yes, even all the way up to the level of the sternum. So that is what we call the transverse cervical nerve. Transverse cervical nerve, C2, C3, just like great auricular nerve. Okay, so that is one thing that you have to do. Therefore, it means that this is the only cutaneous nerve which, yes, we know it's going to be in the posterior triangle of the neck, but it will come all the way even to the level of the anterior triangle of the neck. Therefore, whenever you want to do anything with this sternocleidomastoid muscle, then care must be taken. If you are looking at it from an anterior aspect, okay, then it can't be injured at any of these, points. So the last, nerve which I'm going to talk about, okay, which is also a cutaneous nerve, is what we call the suprascapular nerves. So the suprascapular nerve, yes, we are going to see that it will eventually give off these three branches. Therefore, we call it suprascapular nerves. Yes, similarly, yes, where is it emerging from the posterior aspect? Almost, yes, at the same point, okay, where all these nerves are emerging. But this time around, it comes down, okay, it comes inferiorly, and of course, gets to the level of what we call the lateral aspect of the shoulder region. Then what is it doing? It's going to give off these branches. This will be the anterior branch, this will be the intermediate branch, and then it also gives off a posterior branch, okay. Remember, they are all emerging from somewhere in the posterior aspect of what we call the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Okay, but it is going even up to the level of rib 2. Okay, all these nerves are going up to the level of rib 2. Therefore, all these areas will be supplied, cutaneously, be receiving cutaneous supply from these, suprascapular nerves. Okay, so that is what I want you to actually know. So these nerves, they are very important content of what we call the posterior triangle of the neck. This time around, the root value of suprascapular nerve is C3 and C4. C3 and C4. Okay, so that is that one for you. All right, I'm very grateful for your time this evening. I believe you've understood the cutaneous nerves in the posterior triangle of the neck together with, of course, the spinal accessory nerve. Have a good night, all of you, and may the good Lord richly bless you. Amen.